Hey, that's how you start a Monday. You awake yet?
Wow.
I'm up. Little walk and base for you.
Yeah.
It's 7:08. Joining us live now to talk about the characters of Christmas is a guy named Dan Darling. He is director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Seminary, and he contributes a weekly column for Leadership Journal. You could read his articles as well, Washington Post, Focus on the Family, Christianity Today, all of them, essentially. Welcome back, Dan.
Hey, it's great to be back with you.
Now, it's fitting to have you with us. I know a while back you wrote a book called The Characters of Christmas, and I love that you take time to dig into some of this. And the first one I want to start with is somebody you label the unsung hero of Christmas, and I think that's very true, and it's Joseph. Why would you give him that title?
Well, I just think Joseph, he's not thought of as much as some of the other people in the Christmas story, Mary and, some of the other figures, but he really plays a central role. And if you think about the task that God gave him, it was to be father to a son that wasn't his, and to shepherd that, that child through his life. You think about the way his life changed as soon as Mary became pregnant, and then he had a visit from the angel. He had a dream that told him that this was indeed from God. His life would change. There'd be a stigma on him and Mary for having a child this way, and he'd be tasked with caring for both of them. But one of the things I love about Joseph is he said yes to God, and he always did the next right thing. He was faithful, even when it cost him. He was willing to take care of Mary at great personal cost, even when he was going to divorce her privately before he was visited by the angel. That was the option that would really protect Mary the most. And then when he was told by an angel again to uproot his family and go to Egypt to escape Herod, he did that. And you think of the personal cost it took him to take care of Jesus. But then you see later in the Gospels, when Jesus is an adult and he goes back to his hometown, he's known as Joseph's son.
Yeah.
And so we know in his earthly, in his human, Jesus as a human being really learned from and was shaped by Joseph.
Yeah, I often take time to consider the courage it took Joseph to say yes to that angel. I mean, it ruined his reputation. He probably became a laughingstock of his peers because nobody believed either of them. I mean, who would have believed this? Oh, yeah, no, I got pregnant, but it was from God,
right?
Not a person.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, Joseph and Mary had a visit from an angel, but their family didn't. Their immediate family didn't. And try selling that story to people around you. Some of them probably believed them, but probably most didn't. I mean, we know later that Jesus' own hometown rejected him. His own brothers and sisters didn't believe that he was the Son of God till after the resurrection. So, it was a lonely life. It was a courageous life for him to say yes to God and to follow him in faithfulness. He's a real example, I think, for us today of doing the next right thing, doing the thing that's sometimes hard, even though it's going to cost us. He's an example of obedience.
Yeah, and I think also when you compare him to Zechariah, it's a reminder that it's not a foregone conclusion that Joseph would have done the right thing, because Zechariah made a mistake, right?
That's right. I mean, Zechariah, if you think of his story and Elizabeth, here's an older couple. He's a priest in the temple. They've been praying for years, really for two things. One, that they could have a son, because to not be able to bear children was such a stigma and seen as a curse by God. But also they're praying, as every Jewish person was praying, for the coming of the Messiah. But they're very cynical, as most people were. They had not heard from God for 400 years. No angel visits, no prophets. So they pray these prayers, but they didn't really believe that it would happen. So similar to how we believe maybe about the second coming, that, oh, yeah, we know Jesus is coming again. We're supposed to say that. But do we actually believe it's going to happen? Do we believe God's going to fulfill his promise? And then an angel appears to him when he's in the temple and says, your prayers have been fulfilled. And he's thinking, oh, which prayer? The one for my son, the one for the Messiah, which prayer? And he can't believe it. And it's a disbelief. It's not doubt like some of us have, or awe and wonder like Mary had, where she said, how can these things be? But it's a deep-seated cynicism and disbelief. And God makes him unable to speak. And it's a real example for us to think that sometimes God has to make us quiet
Yeah.
to still our hearts in order for us to hear him and to see him work.
And yet, also, I think God's mercy is displayed in that. I mean, he could have just struck him dead, you know what I mean, for being
That's
so
right.
doubting, but he gave him an opportunity to learn from his mistakes.
He did, and he quieted his mouth, he quieted his heart and his soul, and he had to listen for 9 months. And again, sometimes that's what God has to do to us, is to quiet us, to slow us down, so that we can hear him amidst the stress, the hustle and bustle of the season, amidst our own circumstances, that we have to slow down and hear him speak.
But we don't like that, Dan. We don't like that at all.
We do not like that.
And we get mad at God when it happens.
We really do. And you know, sometimes I think of people at Christmas time like Zechariah who are so desperate and so in despair over the circumstances they face, real hardships, real tragedy, and they believe God instinctively, academically, but they wonder if it's really going to happen. They wonder if God's really going to come through, if they can really trust him. And then when he does, it's almost hard for us to accept. It's hard for us to imagine, oh, God actually has answered our prayers, and to just take it by faith.
Yeah, this is great stuff. Again, it's just about 7:15 here, WCRF. Our guest is Dan Darling, director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Seminary. And he also is a prolific writer and speaker. And Moody Publishers published his book, The Characters of Christmas. We're going through some of the concepts in there, and we'll continue talking with Dan here in just a minute. That's Casting Crowns with some Christmas music here on WCRF. Of course, you can get that whenever you want it, 24/7 during the Christmas season at musicofchristmas.org. Musicofchristmas.org. You can also find that streaming channel from Moody Radio on our app. With us now, Dan Darling, director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Seminary, and we're chatting about the concepts he covered in his book, The Characters of Christmas. I find it fascinating you chose to do an entire chapter on the innkeeper. How did you do that?
Well, I debated that because, you know, there's really a debate about whether there actually was an innkeeper, right? I mean,
Is there?
And scholars really are mixed on, you know, what exactly was the setting? Was it a cave? Was it an inn? Was it? But when you read the narrative, you know, someone had to tell Joseph that there was no room there, so it had to be some proprietor, somebody. But imagine yourself being that person. And, you know, for you, it's just an ordinary night. There's a lot of people coming into town. You're frazzled. You're trying to get spots for everyone. You don't know that this, you know, otherwise ordinary looking couple coming in is, she's carrying the Son of God, that this is the fullness of time, as Paul would later say in Galatians, like all of human history would pivot at this point. You don't know all of that. You're just trying to make things work. But, you know, imagine yourself being that person and how God transformed that ordinary night into one that was a night for history. And it just shows us, I think, that God visits us and God does extraordinary things, often in what seems like ordinary places, out-of-the-way places, through ordinary people that are not necessarily ready for it. And I think there's a lot to learn from the innkeeper.
Yeah, can we be hard on this person for, you know, turning away a pregnant lady? It's pretty harsh.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, he did. They didn't. There was not room there, but he did find a place for them. You know, it was obviously not the ideal place. You know, it was probably a cave with animals nearby, but he did at least do his best to find a place. You wonder in your sanctified imagination later, as he reflected on that night, if he really truly understood who it was that was staying with him, if the people who were staying at that inn, if they understood what was happening that night, and that they were part of God's plan of salvation, God's redemptive history.
Yeah. Now, when you take, all of the characters of Christmas and the Christmas story, is there a way you could draw some sort of thread through them? Like, do they have common traits or something that would help us think more deeply this Christmas?
Well, I think the one common thread is that, they're ordinary people that they didn't realize they would be part of the Christmas story. Now, 2,000 years later, we think of them as these great figures, right? They adorn our nativity sets and they're on our Christmas cards. And, our kids dress up like them for our Christmas pageants. But they didn't know that they were just living their lives, and they're ordinary people. And it's really fascinating how when God chose to announce the coming of the Son of God, the fulfillment of all the prophecy for all the centuries and all the years, he didn't choose to come in a place like Rome or even in Herod's palace where there'd be a lot of attention. He came to faraway places and, places that were forgotten among people who otherwise didn't have much power or agency or anything. And it does show that the kingdom of God really is mostly built with ordinary people who God chooses to cast into this great story. And so I think we could see a little bit of ourselves sometimes in some of these folks.
Well, yeah, and the Lord doesn't seem to ask much more than obedience. Just do what I ask
That's
you to
right.
do. And so that we can all do that, can't we?
That's right. I'm just faithful, simple obedience. I also think you see in the characters of Christmas, you obviously see that he came first to the Jewish people, right, as a fulfillment of promise. But also you see, like in the wise men, the Magi, that people from the nations coming to Jesus, and as part of the fulfillment, the promise he made to Abraham, that he a light to all the nations, and that the gospel is bringing people together from every tribe and tongue and nation into his new creation. And so I think we really need to see that as well.
Now, you've spent so much time considering the characters of Christmas. Have you been able to narrow down, do you have a favorite that really hits your soul, or does it change every year?
It's really hard to say, which one is my favorite. I really enjoyed profiling all of them. And even the sort of figures we don't like. I did a whole chapter on Herod, who is kind of the monster of Christmas. And if you think about every Christmas story, from the Hallmark movies to our favorite classics, there's always an antagonist. There's always an enemy. And Herod's really the original monster of Christmas. And he goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, where God predicted there'd be this clash between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And he's just one in a long line of people trying to go to war with God. And of course, ultimately he doesn't succeed, because that baby survives, and Christ would grow up and go to the cross and defeat sin and death in the grave and be victorious. But I think it's important to look at folks like him as well.
Now, to what extent, as we even look at the tail end of the Christmas story, do you think it's reasonable to characterize Jesus and his family as impoverished refugees? I've heard that stated in recent years.
Yeah, I think we have to, first of all, we have to be careful about kind of projecting modern political issues onto the Christmas story. But I do think it's fair to say, Jesus did flee. He had to flee with his family. He had to flee terror. He had to flee someone who was trying to kill them and persecute them. And he had to go from one place to another. They had to uproot their family and go to Egypt. That wasn't exactly easy. So in a sense, they were refugees. They were refugees in Egypt, fleeing terror. They were, to be a refugee is to be someone who's not in your homeland, who's at the mercy of other countries and other people for survival. And so I think, people have varying approaches and ideas about immigration policy, refugee policy. But I do think you can see in Jesus a refugee. Think about the threadbare existence of being a refugee, and think about, this is the Son of God, the Savior of the world, who is living a very impoverished, threadbare existence for a time. And so I think it tells us that he does identify with the least of these. He does identify with those who are living at the margins and who don't have agency or wealth or money in order to survive.
And now, for all of us, as much as we like hearing you talk about the characters of Christmas and pondering this, the busyness of the season can sometimes sneak up on us, and Christmas will be over by the time we pause. So how can we make a spiritual discipline out of thinking about and pondering what these folks went through?
Well, I think one of the ways we can do that is really, during this Advent season, is to really take time every day to really study the incarnation and read the passages and really drink deeply of what Christmas is really about, the coming of the Son of God, and study it from all the angles and all the perspectives that we see in Scripture. I really think there's two wrong approaches to Christmas that I've seen people take. I think one is to say, get so caught up, as you said, in all the details and the shopping, and I have to do this and that, and then not slow down and really meditate on Christmas. and on Advent. I think the other wrong approach is to kind of be a crank and say, I don't like all the lights and the music,
Right.
and and I see all of that as part of the celebration that the King has come. So if the King has come, we should celebrate with lights and music and food and feast and drink it. And I love this season. I love hearing Christmas music played in all our stores. I love seeing the lights. I love the food and the festivities and the kind of warm feelings people get this time of year. I think it's remarkable. And as Christians, we should really stop and just be thankful that even in 2023, with so many different ideologies and secularism, all that stuff around the world, that still the world essentially stops and at least acknowledges that Jesus was born. Now, we know most people celebrating Christmas are not true believers per se, but at least the world is stopping to acknowledge that Jesus came 2,000 years ago. What a remarkable thing that we have. When Jesus first came as a little baby, no one would think that this tiny baby in the manger was more powerful and would be celebrated 2,000 years later, more than, say, Caesar, who was then powerful in Rome, and Herod and all these others, and yet it's Jesus that endures.
I love that message because, we can often come off looking as the crabby group at Christmas, and we should be
Right.
the last ones to look that way. So I love your advice. Clearly, I just gave it a bell. Okay, it's just about time for us to go again. Dan Darling is director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Seminary. Also a prolific writer. His book we've been chatting about today from Moody Publishers is called The Characters of Christmas, The Unlikely People Caught Up in the Story of Jesus. If folks want to learn more about you and your work and this book, how do they do it?
Best way is to go to my website, danieldarling.com, and with links to where you can buy books there. You go to Moody Publishers website, and they have a great deal on the books as well. And did follow me on social media. You can see all the links on my website there.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Dan. As always, we appreciate your time with us.